The 2,500 people packed into the International Hotel showroom on August 15, 1971, expected a typical Elvis concert. Spectacular costumes, powerful vocals, the charisma that made him the king of rock and roll. What they got instead was a masterclass in using your platform to fight sexism, delivered by a man who was about to publicly challenge his own manager's decision to fire a female performer for the crime of being 26 years old. But the audience didn't know that yet. They were clapping and cheering as Elvis performed his opening numbers, energy high, the show proceeding normally. Elvis's backup singers stood behind him, harmonizing beautifully, including Kathy Westmoreland, who was singing with tears in her eyes because she had just been told she was being replaced for not being young enough or pretty enough for Vegas. The band knew something was off. Elvis kept looking back at Kathy between songs, his face showing an emotion they couldn't quite read. Was he angry? Sad? Determined? Then, about 40 minutes into the show, Elvis did something unexpected. He stopped mid-performance, turned to face his backup singers, and gestured for Kathy to come forward. The audience went quiet, confused about what was happening. This wasn't part of the usual show format. Kathy looked terrified, uncertain whether to move or stay where she was. Elvis walked over to her, took her hand, and led her to center stage. Then he grabbed the microphone and said something that would make headlines across America the next day. If you want to discover how one moment of confronting sexism changed the music industry's treatment of female performers, please subscribe to our channel. This story reveals the power dynamics that still affect entertainment today. 2 hours before the show, Elvis had been walking down the backstage corridor toward his dressing room when he heard Colonel Tom Parker's voice coming from one of the side rooms. What Parker said next made Elvis stop and listen. "Kathy, you've been great. But let's be honest, you're 26 years old. That's getting old for Vegas. We need younger, prettier faces on that stage." Elvis felt his stomach drop. He knew immediately what Parker was doing, had seen it happen to other women in the industry, but had never directly witnessed his own manager participating in the casual sexism that treated female performers as decorative objects with expiration dates. Kathy Westmoreland's response was barely audible, her voice shaking. "I'm 26. That's old?" Parker's tone was dismissive. "This is Vegas, honey. You know how it works. The audience wants to look at beautiful young girls, not women pushing 30. Nothing personal, just business." Elvis pushed open the door, startling both of them. Parker looked annoyed at the interruption. Kathy looked like she wanted to disappear. Elvis addressed Parker directly, his voice tight with controlled anger. "What did you just say to her?" Parker, never one to back down, repeated his reasoning. Vegas was about spectacle, about beauty, about giving audiences what they wanted. Kathy was talented, sure, but her age made her obsolete in a market that demanded youth. The argument that followed was one of the worst fights Elvis and Parker had ever had. Elvis called it sexist garbage, said Parker was treating women like decorations rather than artists, pointed out that male musicians aged without anyone questioning their right to work. Parker countered that Elvis didn't understand the business side, that decisions like this were about profit margins and audience preferences, not personal feelings. The fight escalated until both men were yelling, until Parker finally pulled rank and reminded Elvis of contractual obligations and who actually managed this operation. Elvis stormed out, but not before telling Kathy, "You're not fired." I don't care what he says. But as Elvis prepared for the show, he realized that simply contradicting Parker backstage wasn't enough. This needed to be addressed publicly, needed to be called out in a way that would make it impossible to ignore. Kathy Westmoreland had known this was coming eventually. She was a woman in her 20s, working in an industry that valued youth and appearance over talent and experience, especially in Las Vegas, where the entertainment machine was built on spectacle and sex appeal. She had watched it happen to other female performers. Talented women, gradually pushed out or replaced when they aged past some invisible line that men in power had drawn. But knowing it was coming didn't make it any easier when it actually happened. 26 years old, too old, not pretty enough. The words played on repeat in her mind as she prepared for what she thought would be one of her final performances with Elvis. What made it particularly painful was that Kathy knew she was good at her job. She had trained for years, had perfect pitch, could harmonize beautifully, was professional and reliable. Her talent hadn't diminished. Her work ethic hadn't changed. But none of that mattered if Colonel Parker had decided her appearance was no longer suitable for the Vegas stage. As she stood behind Elvis during the show, singing harmonies she had performed hundreds of times, she kept crying, trying to hide it, trying to maintain professionalism even as her career was being ripped away for reasons that had nothing to do with her actual work. The other backup singers knew what had happened. News traveled fast in the tight-knit community of performers who worked Elvis's shows. They were supportive but also resigned. This was how the industry worked. This was what happened to women who had the audacity to age past their mid-20s in an entertainment culture that treated female performers as interchangeable parts. What none of them knew was that Elvis had a plan, that he was about to do something unprecedented, that Kathy's humiliation was about to become a platform for challenging the sexism built into the entire entertainment system. When Elvis stopped mid-performance and turned to face his backup singers, the band initially thought something was wrong with the sound or the arrangement, but Elvis's face showed determination rather than confusion. He walked directly to Kathy, extended his hand, and led her to center stage. The audience, confused by this departure from the usual show format, went quiet. Kathy looked terrified, having no idea what Elvis was planning. Elvis took the microphone and addressed the crowd with a seriousness that contrasted sharply with his usual showman energy. "I want to introduce you to someone special," Elvis said, his voice carrying to every corner of the showroom. "This is Kathy Westmoreland. She's been singing with me for 2 years. She's one of the most talented vocalists I've ever worked with." The audience applauded politely, still uncertain about where this was going. Elvis continued, his next words cutting through the room like a knife. "Earlier today, my manager told Kathy she's being fired. Want to know why?" The crowd went completely silent. This was clearly not part of the scripted entertainment, because she's 26 years old. That's apparently too old for Las Vegas. And because, in his words, we need prettier faces on stage. The collective gasp from the audience was audible. Kathy stood frozen, shocked that Elvis was exposing this publicly. Backstage, Colonel Parker's face turned red with anger and embarrassment. "Elvis wasn't finished. So I wanted to do something tonight. I wanted you to hear what too old and not pretty enough actually sounds like. Kathy, would you sing something for us?" Kathy, still processing what was happening, nodded. Elvis turned to his band. "Give her a spotlight. Give her the stage. Let's show everyone what my manager thinks isn't good enough for Vegas." What happened next would be remembered as one of the most powerful vocal performances in Las Vegas history. Kathy Westmoreland, with tears streaming down her face, sang "How Great Thou Art," a gospel standard that required enormous vocal range and emotional depth. Her voice, powerful and clear and technically perfect, filled the showroom. She hit notes that seemed impossible, held phrases that demonstrated years of training and natural talent, and delivered an emotional performance that had people in the audience crying. This wasn't just singing, this was art. This was proof that talent and age had nothing to do with each other, that reducing a performer to her appearance was not just sexist, but stupid, ignoring the actual artistry that made entertainment meaningful. When Kathy finished, the audience erupted in a standing ovation that lasted several minutes. People were on their feet, applauding, cheering, many visibly emotional. Elvis let the moment breathe, let the applause continue before he spoke again into the microphone. "That's what 26 and not pretty enough sounds like. That's the voice someone wanted to fire. Anyone here think she should be fired?" The crowd's response was thunderous. "No!" Elvis turned to where Colonel Parker stood in the wings, his next words directed as much at his manager as at the audience. "That settles it then. Kathy stays, and I want to say something else. Elvis addressed the crowd with a seriousness that showed this wasn't just about one singer or one employment decision. What happened to Kathy happens to women in this industry all the time. They get told they're too old when they're barely in their 20s. They get judged on appearance instead of talent. They get pushed out to make room for younger women who will eventually get pushed out too, in a cycle that treats women like they expire. I've watched it happen for years and I'm tired of it. It's wrong, it's sexist, and it needs to stop. The audience applauded again, many women in the crowd responding with particular enthusiasm to finally hearing someone with power acknowledge what they had experienced or witnessed themselves. After the show, the confrontation between Elvis and Colonel Parker was explosive. Parker accused Elvis of humiliating him publicly, of undermining his authority, of making business decisions based on emotion rather than profit. Elvis countered that Parker had humiliated Kathy, that using your authority to fire talented women for aging was abuse of power, not business acumen. The fight revealed a fundamental difference in how they viewed performers. Parker saw them as assets to be managed for maximum profit, while Elvis saw them as human beings deserving of dignity and respect, regardless of their commercial value. The argument ended with Elvis drawing a clear line. He would no longer allow Parker to make personnel decisions without his approval. Any firing or hiring, especially of female performers, would need Elvis's explicit consent. Parker could manage business arrangements, tour schedules, and financial matters, but he could not treat performers, particularly women, as disposable commodities to be replaced when they aged past some arbitrary threshold. For Parker, this was a significant loss of power. For Elvis, it was a necessary stand against systemic sexism he had tolerated for too long. Kathy Westmoreland continued performing with Elvis until his death in 1977, and her career extended far beyond that. But more importantly, what Elvis did that night changed how she understood her own value and gave her the courage to advocate for herself and other women in the industry. She became vocal about sexism in entertainment, speaking at industry events about the double standards that allowed male performers to age while female performers were discarded. She talked openly about how Elvis's public stand had not just saved her job, but had validated her worth as an artist, rather than an object to be evaluated on appearance. In interviews years later, Kathy credited that night with teaching her that fighting sexism required people with power to use that power on behalf of those without it. Elvis could have handled Kathy's situation quietly, could have overruled Parker backstage and left it at that. But by making it public, by forcing the audience to hear and see the sexism explicitly, he created a moment that couldn't be ignored or downplayed. He used his platform not just to help one woman, but to challenge a system that harmed all women in entertainment. The story of what Elvis did for Kathy Westmoreland spread quickly through entertainment circles. Some praised Elvis for taking a stand against sexism and ageism that was endemic in the industry. Others criticized him for publicly humiliating his manager and for injecting social issues into entertainment. But the conversation itself was significant. For the first time, major publications were writing about age discrimination against women in entertainment, about the double standards that judged women on appearance, while allowing men to age without professional consequences, about the sexist assumption that female performers existed primarily for male viewing pleasure rather than as artists with valuable skills. Some venues and performers began reconsidering their own policies around age and hiring. While change was slow and incomplete, there was increased awareness that treating women as having expiration dates was not just morally wrong, but was causing the industry to lose talented performers. The conversation Elvis started that night in 1971 contributed to a broader movement that would eventually lead to more explicit anti-discrimination policies, though progress remained frustratingly slow and uneven. Elvis's defense of Kathy Westmoreland wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a pattern of behavior that complicated his public image. In an era when many male performers treated women as groupies or decoration, Elvis worked with talented female musicians and vocalists and defended them when they faced discrimination. He paid them fairly, gave them spotlight moments, and used his authority to protect them from the sexism that was built into the entertainment industry's power structure. This doesn't make Elvis a perfect feminist, or erase other problematic aspects of his life and career, but it does show that he was capable of recognizing sexism when he saw it, and willing to use his power to fight it, even when doing so created conflict with his own management team. In 1971, when feminism was often dismissed or mocked in mainstream culture, Elvis's public stand against sexist hiring practices was significant. It demonstrated that men could be allies in fighting gender discrimination, that using your platform to challenge injustice was more important than maintaining comfortable business relationships. Today, the entertainment industry still struggles with sexism and ageism, particularly regarding female performers. Women still face pressure to maintain impossible beauty standards, still get replaced by younger performers, still experience discrimination based on age and appearance rather than talent. But the conversation has changed. The awareness is greater, and more people are willing to call out these practices as unacceptable. Stories like what Elvis did for Kathy Westmoreland contribute to that change by providing historical examples of what allyship looks like, what it means to use power and privilege to defend people who have less of both. Kathy herself became an advocate for younger women facing similar discrimination, offering advice and support, sharing her story as an example that you don't have to accept unjust treatment quietly. She encouraged women to demand respect, to know their worth, to push back against systems designed to devalue them. And she always credited Elvis with showing her that fighting back was possible, that speaking truth to power could work if you were brave enough to do it. The story of Elvis defending Kathy Westmoreland offers several important lessons that remain relevant today. First, that people with power and privilege have a responsibility to use those advantages to fight injustice, not just to benefit themselves. Elvis could have stayed silent about Kathy's firing, could have overruled it privately. But by making it public, he forced a larger conversation that benefited more people than just one singer. Second, that fighting sexism and other forms of discrimination sometimes requires risk and confrontation. Elvis damaged his relationship with his manager, created awkward tensions, and faced criticism for making a scene. But the alternative was allowing sexist practices to continue unchallenged, and he decided that wasn't acceptable. Real allyship isn't comfortable or convenient. Third, that talent and worth are not determined by age, appearance, or compliance with narrow beauty standards. Kathy Westmoreland's performance that night proved what should have been obvious, that a talented 26-year-old woman had exactly as much right to work as anyone else, that her value came from her artistry, not her appearance, that judging female performers on different criteria than male performers was arbitrary and unjust. On August 15, 1971, Elvis Presley could have done a standard Vegas show, could have entertained his audience, and maintained comfortable business relationships, and avoided conflict with his powerful manager. Instead, he chose to stop the show, bring a crying backup singer to center stage, expose the sexist reasoning behind her firing, and challenge both his audience and his industry to recognize and reject discrimination against women. It wasn't a perfect solution to systemic sexism in entertainment. One good act doesn't erase all the problems or solve all the issues, but it was a moment when someone with power chose to use it for something meaningful. When a man at the peak of his career decided that fighting sexism mattered more than maintaining comfortable business relationships. Kathy Westmoreland continued her career, inspired other women, and spent decades advocating for fair treatment of female performers. Colonel Parker never again tried to fire someone for being too old at 26. And thousands of people in that showroom witnessed what it looked like when someone challenged sexist practices publicly, rather than accepting them as inevitable. That's the legacy of that night. Not just that one woman kept her job, but that a conversation started, that standards were challenged, that people in power were shown that using that power for justice was possible. Elvis Presley was the king of rock and roll, but on that night in Las Vegas, he was also an ally in the fight against sexism, using his platform to amplify a woman's voice and challenge an industry's discrimination. That's worth remembering and celebrating.